In 1934, Congress passed the first act that governed telecommunication in this country. And what they said was that media, at that time radio was the central focus, should serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And the reason that Congress could do that is because the airwaves, the waves over which radio was transmitted, and now, of course, subsequently television and telecommunication, that those airwaves are a public asset, like air and water that we all share in common. And so in exchange for private carriers being able to use them, they had to be held accountable to the public. And the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was set up in order to write and enforce the regulations in order to make sure that those companies fulfill those obligations. Today, they're interpreted as meaning that broadcasters are committed to the values of localism, diversity, and competition. And in theory, anyway, that's what the FCC is out to enforce. Well, the Congress says that you can become a network just by the same virtues of private enterprise. You create a company and you look for audiences and you stay in business. It's the affiliates of the networks, the stations around the country, that have to apply for licenses because they're the ones who are actually sending the signals out to the public. The signal over the airwaves doesn't come from a central network. It comes from a local station. And so there could be as many or as few stations, according to Congress, as is possible based on the marketplace. The reality is that it doesn't quite ever work out that way. If you look, for example, at the radio business, the number of radio stations that used to be independent or owned by smaller stations has dropped phenomenally, and there are only 2 or 3 really big radio station owners that have gobbled up hundreds and thousands of stations around the country. It's just as difficult to be an independent television station. Independent television network is even harder. Well, it's surprising when people actually learn the economics of the television business. It turns out that for a station to have a license, they pay the public for the right to use our broadcast airwaves exactly $0.00. And in order to keep that license, every 8 years, they have to send a postcard to the FCC saying, "Hi, remember us? We'd like to renew our license." It didn't always work that way. The big change came in the 1980s under President Reagan. He appointed an FCC commissioner named Mark Fowler, who announced that a television was a toaster with pictures. And so, therefore, television stations should be regulated pretty much in the same way that we regulate appliances. If they don't electrocute you, then it's basically okay. So ever since then, the obligations that television stations had to do things like air local stories on their news or find out what people in their communities actually wanted to see on television, those obligations went by the wayside, along with something called the Fairness Doctrine, which made sure that if a station airs one point of view, it has to also air the other point of view. In fact, there's not even an obligation to air news anymore. I noticed that the CW has a big promotional campaign on right now that's bragging in a series of spots, "The CW, we don't have any of that boring news." So they're actually using it as a way to develop brand identity in markets, saying, you know, we're all ice cream and no broccoli. That's why you should watch us. So ever since the 80s, it's been pretty much impossible for a station to lose its license because there's pretty much no reason for a station to lose its license, even though the laws are still on the books that say that stations have to provide a diversity of voices in a given community, that women and minorities should get a fair crack at ownership, that local stories should be covered as well as national stories. Those laws are still there, but the FCC has decided that the magic of the marketplace means that they don't have to be enforced. That somehow, and this is the latest version of the argument about the toaster, that, well, now that there's the internet, really, the public interest, that's what the public is interested in. So if they're interested in news, they can always go find it somewhere. It doesn't matter, say, the broadcasters, that the biggest public square is still occupied by television. It doesn't matter, because if someone is determined to find something out, they can always find it now, thanks to the internet.